One child whispered into the frozen night, but it was the dog who heard her. The storm rolled in from the northern plains, swallowing North Haven in a white, merciless silence. While the rest of the town slept behind locked doors, one retired K-9 named Shadow stood alert on the porch of a lonely cabin, ears pricked, nose twitching against the cutting wind. Somewhere out there, a little girl was breaking. Somewhere out there, a cry too soft for the world to hear had been buried under the weight of the storm. No one else heard the tiny voice carried by the blizzard, "Please, don't let him die." But Shadow did, and what he led his handler, Dylan Mercer, to that night would shatter everything they thought they knew. A forgotten girl, a starving baby, a grieving soldier, and a dog who refused to forget what duty meant, even after the war. This isn't just a rescue story. This is a story about finding home when you thought you'd lost it forever. North Haven, Minnesota. A bitter Christmas Eve wrapped the small town beneath a relentless blizzard, its streets buried in thick snow and silence pressing in from all sides. Dylan Mercer trudged through the white-laden streets, his boots crunching against the frozen earth, breath curling into the icy night air. At 45, Dylan carried himself with the posture of a man shaped by discipline, his tall, broad frame still sturdy despite the years. His short, dark brown hair, now touched by threads of gray, clung damp to his forehead beneath the cold. A rough beard shadowed his strong jawline, and his piercing blue-gray eyes seemed distant, perpetually scanning the world as though expecting danger. Once, those eyes had carried warmth, back when Elena, his wife, was alive. She had been slender and graceful, her chestnut brown hair cascading in loose waves, her soft olive skin glowing even in the dullest light. Her laughter could soften the edges of Dylan's rougher days, her gentle hands grounding him in a way the world never had. But that warmth had been ripped away 3 years ago, the day she died giving birth to their son. Dylan had paced the hospital floors with trembling hands, hope clinging to him like a lifeline until the doctor appeared, his face pale, his words shattering everything. Elena was gone, and so was Jacob, the baby boy Dylan had spent nights dreaming of holding. That loss carved a hollow into Dylan, leaving a man who carried his pain like a permanent shadow. His once lively spirit dulled into silence, his social ties crumbled, and he retreated into solitude. He left his old life behind and bought a modest wooden cabin on the outskirts of North Haven, trading crowded city streets for endless pine trees and open skies. There, his only constant companion was Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with sleek black and tan fur, powerful shoulders, and amber eyes that missed nothing. Shadow had served alongside Dylan in Iraq, trained as a K-9 tracker, capable of detecting explosives and rescuing injured soldiers from dangerous terrain. Intelligent and fiercely loyal, Shadow had always seemed more than a dog. He was Dylan's last tether to a sense of purpose, the only being he allowed close. Even now, 3 years removed from active duty, Shadow carried the vigilance of a soldier. His ears twitched at the faintest sounds, his movements precise, his instincts razor-sharp. That night, Dylan walked with his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his heavy coat, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He had taken to nightly walks to quiet his mind, though they rarely succeeded. The blizzard whipped against his face, biting into his skin, but he welcomed the cold. It was a sensation sharp enough to pull him from the recurring memories he couldn't escape. Yet, something in the air felt different, tense, as though the night itself held its breath. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. The dog's ears pricked, his body stiffening, muscles taut beneath his thick coat. A low, rumbling growl reverberated from deep in his chest as he pulled against the leash, his nose lifted into the swirling wind. Dylan followed the direction of Shadow's gaze, squinting into the dimly lit alley behind a row of shuttered shops, the visibility broken by dancing sheets of snow. At first, he thought the shadows were playing tricks on him, his exhausted mind imagining movement where there was none. But then he saw it. A small figure crouched beside a frozen dumpster, digging with thin, trembling hands into a half-buried trash bag. Dylan's chest tightened. The figure was tiny, no taller than his hip, her frail frame wrapped in nothing but a tattered red short-sleeved shirt, the fabric frayed and stained, clinging uselessly against the piercing cold. Her skinny arms were flushed raw, covered in goosebumps, and her tangled blonde hair clung damp against her dirt-streaked face. Her bare legs were dusted in frost, and her lips were pale with the beginnings of hypothermia. Cradled against her narrow chest was a bundle wrapped in an old, threadbare blanket. Then Dylan heard it. A faint, broken sound, muffled beneath the fabric. A baby's cry. For a moment, Dylan froze, his entire body locked as though the cold had finally reached his bones. The sight crashed into him with the weight of memory. Elena's laugh, the soft yellow nursery they had painted together, the dreams they'd built around a child he never got to hold. Grief swelled like a storm inside him, clawing at wounds that had never healed. Shadow whined softly, sensing Dylan's hesitation, his amber eyes flicking between the man and the fragile figure in the snow. Dylan forced his breath steady, forcing himself back into the present. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward, lowering his voice into the calm, soothing tone he used to use during high-stakes operations. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently, one gloved hand raised in plain sight. "I'm not here to hurt you." The little girl's head shot up, wide hazel eyes locking onto his, glimmering with fear. She clutched the bundle closer, her thin shoulders shaking violently, as though preparing to run. Dylan stopped several feet away and dropped to one knee in the snow, lowering his imposing frame. Shadow mirrored him, sitting silently at his side, his ears forward but his posture relaxed, an unspoken message of safety. "What's your name?" Dylan asked softly, careful not to startle her. For a long, agonizing moment, she said nothing, her lips pressed tight, breath hitching in ragged puffs. Then, barely audible over the wind, came a whisper. "Ava." Dylan nodded gently, repeating it as though the act grounded her presence in reality. "That's a beautiful name, Ava. I'm Dylan, and this is Shadow." He gestured towards the dog, who lowered his head slightly, his gaze steady and non-threatening. Ava's bottom lip quivered as her gaze flicked between Dylan and the streets behind him, distrust clear in every line of her small face. Finally, in a voice cracked and hoarse, she whispered words that made Dylan's stomach twist. "Please, don't let him die." Dylan's eyes dropped to the bundle in her arms, where he saw a tiny face, pale and fragile, his breaths shallow and uneven. The baby couldn't have been more than 3 months old. "Who's this?" Dylan asked softly, though his voice nearly broke. "My baby brother," Ava murmured, glancing down at the boy. "Finn." Dylan swallowed hard, forcing back the tide of anger and sadness tightening his chest. He scanned Ava's trembling frame, her teeth chattering violently, her small hands stiff and red from the cold. These children wouldn't last much longer out here. "Where are your parents, Ava?" he asked, keeping his voice as steady as he could. Ava shook her head, slowly, clutching Finn tighter, her breath shallow, the weight of her words heavy with pain. Mama won't wake up. She's gone." Her voice faltered, breaking into tiny gasps. "Grandma's in the hospital, and Victor." She hesitated, biting her chapped lip before whispering the last part. "Victor said he doesn't want us anymore." Dylan exhaled sharply, the heat of frustration rising in his chest, though he kept his expression soft for Ava's sake. Whoever Victor was, the thought of a grown man abandoning these children in this weather clawed at his gut. "I'm going to help you," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice solid, deliberate. "I promise, Ava. But we need to get you both warm first." She hesitated, her wide eyes searching his face as though looking for cracks in his promise. Dylan stayed perfectly still, his hand slowly reaching into his pocket until he pulled out a protein bar, opening it in deliberate silence before offering it to her. Her stomach growled audibly, and after a pause she extended one small, trembling hand to take it, glancing at Shadow briefly before nibbling carefully. Shadow lowered his head, ears relaxed, his quiet presence easing her fear. "Come with me," Dylan said softly, standing but keeping his movements slow. "It's not safe out here. You and Finn need warmth, food, safety." For a moment, Ava didn't move, torn between fear and desperation. But when Shadow padded forward a few steps, giving a soft bark, she finally nodded, hugging Finn close. Dylan walked slightly ahead, shielding them from the cutting wind, while Shadow stayed at Ava's side, his steady presence guiding her footsteps. Ava gripped the thick fur at Shadow's neck for balance, leaning into him as though she instinctively trusted the dog more than any stranger. By the time they reached Dylan's cabin, Finn's cries had quieted into weak whimpers, Ava's small body trembling violently beneath the ragged shirt. Dylan unlocked the door quickly, ushering them inside, where faint warmth from the wood-burning stove greeted them. As the blizzard howled outside, Dylan shut the door firmly, his gaze falling on the two fragile souls before him. He didn't yet know who Victor was, or why Ava's voice trembled when she said his name. But as he watched her cradle Finn protectively, her dirt-streaked cheeks glistening with silent tears, he understood one thing clearly. His life, and theirs, had just changed forever. The storm raged outside Dylan Mercer's cabin, snow pelting against the frosted windows in relentless waves. Inside, the faint heat from the wood-burning stove struggled to fight back the bitter cold that clung to everything. The dim lamplight cast long shadows across the small living room, where Ava sat curled on the edge of Dylan's worn couch, clutching her baby brother tightly to her chest. The girl's tangled blonde hair still clung damply to her cheeks, and her wide hazel eyes darted nervously toward the door as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Finn, bundled in the ragged blanket, let out soft, uneven whimpers as his tiny fingers twitched in his sleep. Dylan crouched by the stove, stacking logs, trying to focus on the mundane task while his thoughts churned violently. He stole glances at the children, his jaw tightening as anger simmered beneath the surface. What kind of man abandons two defenseless kids in a snowstorm? The name Ava whispered outside still echoed in his head. Victor. Rising slowly, Dylan picked up his phone and dialed the number of Rachel Collins, the only social worker he trusted from his rare past dealings with child welfare cases during his volunteer work at the local veterans center. Rachel was 35, a petite woman with shoulder-length auburn hair, fair skin dotted with faint freckles, and sharp green eyes that rarely missed details. Known for her patience and empathy, she had spent nearly a decade working in child protective services, driven by a personal tragedy, losing her younger sister to neglect when they were children. That event had shaped her entire career, making her fiercely protective of vulnerable kids. Rachel's voice came through the line after a few rings, calm but concerned. "Dylan, it's late. What's going on?" "I found a little girl," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. 7 years old. Out in the snow, she was digging through the trash, carrying a baby. There was a pause, then Rachel's voice softened, layered with urgency. "Are they safe now?" "They're here with me," Dylan replied. "The girl's name is Ava. Her baby brother's Finn. Their mother's gone. Grandmother's in the hospital. She says her stepfather, Victor Dane, doesn't want them." Rachel cursed softly under her breath, her professionalism slipping for a moment. "Dylan, listen. Don't let anyone take them tonight. The roads are shut down with this storm. I can't get there until morning. But keep them warm, keep them fed, and I'll call the county hospital to confirm details. If Victor shows up, do not engage. Just call me, and we'll handle it legally." "I will," Dylan promised, his voice low. His gaze drifted back to Ava, who sat silently rocking Finn, her small body shivering under the oversized shirt Dylan had lent her. When he hung up, Dylan knelt in front of Ava, keeping his voice soft, the way one might speak to a skittish animal. "Rachel's going to help us," he said. "You're safe here." Ava hesitated, her gaze fixed on the baby, fingers tightening on the thin blanket. Finally, she whispered, her voice rough from cold and exhaustion. "Mama got sick. Fever. She couldn't breathe one night. I tried to wake her, but—" Her words broke off, choked by a quiet sob. Dylan's heart clenched, but he stayed silent, letting her speak at her pace. "She died," Ava continued, staring blankly at the flames. "Grandma Margaret tried to take care of us, but she got sick too. She's in the hospital now. Then Victor started yelling. He said Finn cries too much. He said we cost too much money. And then—" Ava hesitated again, glancing nervously at Dylan as if afraid he wouldn't believe her. "Some people came to the house. 2 men. They were strangers. They brought these bags and they took Finn." Dylan froze, his breath catching. "They took him?" Ava shook her head quickly, correcting herself. "Not all of him. They took his blood. They stuck needles in him. Mama yelled at Victor and told them to stop, but he made her leave the room. After that, Mama cried a lot." Her tiny voice trembled, breaking into jagged sobs. Dylan's jaw set hard, a low burn rising in his chest. Something about this didn't add up. Ava's mother dying suddenly, strangers taking Finn's blood, and Victor seemingly complicit. His instincts, honed by years in Iraq, screamed that this was bigger than a neglect case. Shadow, who had been lying near the stove, raised his head and let out a low whine, amber eyes fixed on the stuffed teddy bear Ava clung to tightly in her free hand. The dog rose and padded over, sniffing insistently at the worn toy. Dylan frowned. "What's in there, buddy?" Dylan muttered, crouching down beside Shadow. The teddy bear was old, its seams frayed and one button eye missing. Ava clutched it tighter as Dylan reached for it, shrinking slightly against the couch. It's Mama's," she whispered. Dylan softened his tone, careful not to frighten her. "Can I just look?" I promise I'll give it right back." Ava hesitated, but after a moment, she slowly handed him the bear, watching with wide, nervous eyes. Dylan turned it over carefully, his fingers brushing along the stitching until he felt something hard tucked deep inside the lining. Curious, he worked open a small tear near the base and slid out a tiny silver USB drive, cold against his palm. Shadow gave a quiet huff, tail tapping lightly against the wooden floor. Dylan stared at the object for a long moment, his gut tightening. Whatever this was, Elena would have called it a breadcrumb, a sign pointing toward something much larger than they could yet see. He slipped the USB into his pocket without comment, deciding not to frighten Ava further. The rest of the night stretched long and quiet, broken only by Finn's occasional cries and the soft rustling of snow against the cabin windows. Dylan gave Ava a bowl of warm broth and half a grilled cheese sandwich, which she ate slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear. Afterward, he tucked both children into the small guest room, layering every spare blanket he had around them. Standing in the doorway, Dylan watched Ava curl protectively around her baby brother, the teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest, her breathing finally evening out in exhausted sleep. A wave of emotion washed over him, unsteady and sharp, twisting somewhere deep in his chest where old scars lived. Shadow nudged his leg softly, letting out a quiet chuff, as if reminding him this was only the beginning. Dylan rested a hand on the dog's head, staring into the storm beyond the glass. Something wasn't right. The sudden death, the strangers, the needles, the USB drive. Dylan didn't know yet what Victor was tangled up in, but he knew one thing with unshakable certainty. He had stumbled into something dangerous. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, protecting Ava and Finn suddenly felt like the most important mission of his life. The storm still battered the cabin through the night, but inside, the crackle of the wood-burning stove brought a small measure of comfort. Dylan Mercer sat at the kitchen table, Shadow resting at his feet, as his thumb rolled the tiny silver USB drive across his palm. The cabin was dimly lit, the quiet broken only by Finn's soft breathing from the guest room and the occasional creak of wood beneath the wind's relentless assault. Sleep wasn't an option tonight. His mind kept circling back to Ava's words about the strangers, the needles, and Victor's cold dismissal. Finally, Dylan pushed back his chair and moved to the corner desk where an aging laptop sat. He hesitated before plugging in the USB, his jaw tightening. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes following Dylan's movements as if sensing the weight of the moment. The screen flickered, and after a brief pause, a folder appeared. Dylan clicked it open, and his breath stalled. The folder contained encrypted files, but one labeled Project Helios caught his attention. He opened it, scanning rapidly. His hands tightened around the mouse as he realized what he was reading. A series of confidential reports from Arden Pharmaceuticals, a privately funded biomedical research corporation known publicly for producing pediatric treatments. But these documents painted a much darker picture. One report detailed an ongoing clinical trial involving infants carrying a rare immune mutation, a genetic marker scientists believed could unlock cures for several life-threatening illnesses. And there, under a highlighted section, was Finn's name. Dylan's throat constricted as his gaze locked on the description. Subject F23, Finn Lawson. Age, 3 months. Possesses heightened production of modified T-cell antibodies. High potential for Phase 3 testing. Jesus, Dylan whispered under his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. He kept scrolling, jaw clenched, absorbing each revelation like a blow. These weren't routine medical studies. These were unauthorized human trials, and infants were the targets. Shadow shifted uneasily at Dylan's side, letting out a low whine. Dylan reached down, absently scratching the dog's head before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he hadn't called in years, Ethan Cole. Ethan had been Dylan's closest friend during their deployment in Iraq. Back then, Ethan was a natural leader, tall and broad-shouldered with sharp features, his sun-creased face framed by close-cropped sandy hair and a short, trimmed beard. His deep-set green eyes carried the same mix of calm and intensity that had made him invaluable under fire. After returning home, Ethan transitioned into law enforcement, becoming a respected detective with the North Haven Police Department. He was relentless on cases involving exploitation or abuse, shaped by his own upbringing in a broken foster system. Dylan knew if anyone could help him, it was Ethan. The call connected after 2 rings. "Dylan!" Ethan's voice came through, hoarse from sleep but instantly alert. "Yeah," Dylan said quietly, glancing toward the guest room to make sure Ava was still asleep. "I need your help. I found something bad." "You don't call me after 3 years unless it's serious," Ethan replied, his tone sharpening. "What's going on?" Dylan explained everything in clipped sentences. Finding Ava and Finn in the snow, Victor abandoning them, the strangers taking Finn's blood, and now the files from the USB. There was a pause on the other end before Ethan's voice lowered into a near growl. "Arden Pharmaceuticals," Ethan muttered. "Damn it, Dylan, we've had our eyes on them for a while. There have been whispers, illegal trials, unreported experiments, but nothing we could nail down. If Finn's name is in their files, this is bigger than we thought." "Victor works there," Dylan said grimly. "Middle management. It looks like he signed consent forms. He was selling Finn to them." Ethan swore softly, his voice sharp. That explains why Child Protective Services didn't flag the home sooner. Victor probably buried every report. "Listen, Dylan, this is dangerous. If Arden's protecting their research, they'll go to extreme lengths to keep it quiet." Dylan leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his tired face. "I don't care what they want. I'm not letting them take him." Ethan hesitated, then said, "I'll dig into Arden from my side. But be careful. If Victor's connected, odds are he isn't working alone. Don't leave the cabin unlocked. If anyone comes asking about the kids, you call me first. Don't open the door." Dylan agreed, ending the call, but unease hung heavy in the air. He sat there for a long while, staring at the USB drive on the table, his thoughts tangled in knots. Every instinct from his years in combat screamed danger, but there was no scenario where he could step away from this. Suddenly, Shadow stood up sharply, ears pricked, body stiffening as his nose lifted toward the door. Dylan froze, following his gaze, listening. Outside, faintly muffled by the storm, came the crunch of footsteps on snow. He moved silently across the cabin, checking the lock on the door and peering through the frosted window. A figure stood near the tree line, mostly hidden by the swirling snow, watching the cabin. Then, just as Dylan blinked, the figure vanished into the storm. Dylan returned to the table, heart pounding, and glanced toward the guest room where Ava and Finn slept. He didn't tell her what he'd seen. Not yet. Shadow paced near the door, restless, his amber eyes locked on the window. Dylan crouched beside him, lowering his voice. "Easy, boy. We'll keep them safe." As the hours dragged into the early morning, Dylan sat in silence, one hand resting on Shadow's fur, the other clenched around the USB. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. Victor Dane wasn't just a cruel stepfather. He was a link in a chain leading to something much larger, something darker than Dylan had imagined. And now they would be coming. The snowstorm had calmed by late afternoon, leaving a fragile silence draped over the pine-covered hills surrounding Dylan Mercer's cabin. Pale winter light filtered through heavy clouds, making the world outside look washed in silver and shadow. Inside, Dylan sat at the wooden kitchen table. Shadow sprawled at his feet, his laptop still open to the encrypted files he had spent the better part of the morning trying to analyze. Every time he looked at Finn sleeping peacefully in the guest room, the reality of what he had discovered burned deeper. Arden Pharmaceuticals wasn't just interested in research. They were hunting Ava's baby brother. A sharp knock rattled the cabin door, breaking the fragile quiet. Shadow's ears perked instantly, his head snapping toward the sound, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Dylan's hand went instinctively to the handle of the drawer where his sidearm rested. Few people ever visited him out here, not without warning, and after the shadow he saw near the tree line the night before, his instincts screamed caution. He rose, crossing the room in 3 long strides, keeping one hand low as he opened the door. Standing on the porch was Victor Dane. Victor was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with an angular face sharpened by arrogance rather than hardship. His slicked-back dark hair was perfectly in place despite the damp chill, and his expensive charcoal overcoat contrasted sharply against the rustic cabin setting. A faint trace of cologne lingered in the air, cutting through the natural scent of pine and smoke. Behind his polished appearance, though, there was something off. A controlled sharpness in his pale blue eyes, like a predator masking its teeth behind a polite smile. "Dylan Mercer," Victor said smoothly, his voice calm but edged with entitlement. "I think you have something that belongs to me." Dylan leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "You'll have to be more specific." Victor's gaze flicked past Dylan toward the interior of the cabin, his jaw tightening. "Ava, and the boy. You've got no right keeping them here." "They were outside," Dylan replied evenly, voice low and steady. "Alone, in the snow, searching trash for food, so forgive me if I stepped in where you failed." Victor's composure faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, lips curling into a thin smile. "You don't understand the situation," he said, stepping closer, his expensive boots crunching lightly on the snow. "Their grandmother is sick. I'm doing what's best for them, finding the right home, the right care." "You mean the right deal," Dylan interrupted, his words sharp enough to cut the chill. Victor's eyes hardened, his carefully controlled facade slipping. "You're walking into something you don't understand, Mercer," he warned, his tone tightening into something closer to a threat. "Give me Ava and Finn now, and we can make this easy." Dylan's grip on the door tightened, but his voice remained level. "You want them, Victor? Call the county. Call Child Protective Services. Call anyone you want. But you're not walking out of here with them today." Victor's smile faded entirely, replaced by cold hostility. He stepped back, slowly, his pale eyes locking on Dylan's with quiet malice. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, his tone almost mocking. People get hurt when they meddle in things they don't understand. Before Dylan could respond, Shadow let out a sharp bark, the sudden sound startling Victor enough to make him flinch slightly. Dylan caught it, that tiny break in control, and knew instantly that he had struck a nerve. Without another word, Victor turned on his heel, his boots crunching through the snow as he stalked toward his sleek black SUV parked along the road. Dylan didn't relax until the hum of the engine faded into the distance. The rest of the evening was unsettlingly quiet. Ava remained silent during dinner, pushing her food around the plate while keeping Finn close against her chest. Dylan didn't mention Victor's visit. She didn't need more fear piling onto the weight already pressing down on her tiny shoulders. After Ava and Finn were settled for the night, Dylan walked the perimeter of the cabin, the icy wind cutting against his face as he checked the locks and security cameras he had installed when he first moved in. He had lived in isolation for years, but tonight his sanctuary no longer felt safe. Hours later, deep into the night, the sharp crack of breaking glass jolted Dylan awake. Shadow reacted first, leaping from his spot at the foot of Dylan's bed with a furious bark that shook the silence. Dylan grabbed his flashlight and sidearm, moving quickly but silently toward the sound. Another crash came from the side of the cabin where he had mounted the security camera. By the time Dylan reached the door, Shadow had already lunged outside, his powerful body cutting through the deep snow, ears pinned flat as his growls sliced through the night. Dylan followed close behind, the icy air searing his lungs as he scanned the tree line. A dark figure sprinted away from the cabin, moving fast but clumsily through the drifts, dressed head to toe in black. Shadow gave chase, closing the distance with startling speed, his deep barking echoing through the pines. Dylan shouted a sharp command, a word Shadow knew from their service days, and the dog veered, cutting the figure off just enough to force them into the deeper snow. The intruders stumbled, cursed under their breath, then scrambled up and disappeared into the dark woods before Dylan could get close enough to tackle them. Shadow circled back, his chest heaving, teeth bared and fur bristling, before pressing close to Dylan's side. Returning to the cabin, Dylan found the side security camera smashed, wires dangling, footprints leading off toward the main road before vanishing into the storm's remnants. He crouched low, inspecting the tracks, his jaw tight. Whoever sent that person hadn't come here to scare them. They had come prepared. Shadow nudged his hand, amber eyes glinting beneath the faint moonlight, waiting for a command. Dylan rested his palm on the dog's head, exhaling slowly. "This isn't just Victor," Dylan murmured, his voice barely audible over the quiet howl of the wind. "Someone else wants them, and they're willing to do anything to get them." He knew then, beyond any doubt, that the documents on the USB, Victor's visit, and the smashed camera weren't separate pieces. They were threads in the same net tightening around Ava and Finn, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the one coming for them. The storm had returned by nightfall, a relentless wind sweeping over the pine-covered ridges of North Haven and howling against the walls of Dylan Mercer's cabin. Inside, the dim light from the wood stove cast warm shadows across the small living room. Ava had finally fallen asleep in the guest room, curled protectively around Finn, clutching the frayed teddy bear as if it were her last anchor to safety. Dylan sat slouched on the couch, his back aching, his thoughts racing. The weight of the USB's revelations and Victor's visit pressed heavy on his mind, but exhaustion eventually pulled him under. Shadow lay at his feet, his powerful body stretched out but restless, his black and tan fur bristling slightly with every sound from outside. The 5-year-old German Shepherd, trained for combat detection and tracking, rarely truly slept anymore. Even in the stillness, his amber eyes half open, ears twitching against the whistling wind, as though bracing for something unseen. At 2:17 a.m., Shadow's head shot up. A soft creak on the porch, muffled by the storm, pricked his ears. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Dylan stirred awake just as Shadow leapt to his feet, barking sharply. The sudden noise jolted Ava upright in the guest room. Her small scream blended with Finn's panicked wails. Dylan grabbed his sidearm, heart pounding, and moved swiftly toward the noise. But by the time he reached the hall, a sharp gust of frigid air rushed in. The front door was ajar. He lunged into the guest room only to find Ava sobbing on the bed, empty arms clutching at the blanket. "Finn," she choked out, tears streaking her dirt-streaked cheeks. They took him." Dylan didn't hesitate. His instincts from Iraq took over. He crouched low, scanning the floor with the flashlight in his free hand, spotting fresh footprints pressed into the thin carpet of melting snow. Outside, Shadow bounded forward, nose low, moving fast across the clearing until he locked onto a trail leading into the woods. Dylan followed, the freezing air cutting through his lungs as they moved quickly across the drifts. His boots sank deep in the snow as Shadow pulled ahead, weaving effortlessly between skeletal pines. Soon, the trail emerged onto a half-buried service road, and Dylan crouched low behind a fallen tree. Ahead, faint lights glimmered through the storm. It was an old cold storage facility near the edge of the industrial district, just a mile from Arden Pharmaceuticals. The building was low, its concrete walls streaked with age, faint frost clinging to the broken windows. A black van was parked near the side entrance, its headlights dimmed. 2 men in dark winter gear moved quickly around the vehicle, one carrying a bulky duffel bag, the other speaking sharply into a radio. Dylan raised a fist, a signal Shadow remembered well from their years together in the military. The dog lowered his body, muscles tense beneath his thick coat, silent and focused. Dylan scanned the clearing, his breath forming steady clouds as he waited for the right moment. A third figure stepped into view from the side door, smaller than the others, shuffling unsteadily under the weight of something in his arms. Dylan's pulse surged. He caught a glimpse of Finn's tiny bundled form, carried awkwardly as the stranger barked an order in a clipped tone. He couldn't wait any longer. Dylan launched forward, snow exploding beneath his boots as Shadow surged ahead, a low, guttural snarl tearing through the quiet. One of the men spun, startled, and reached for something at his belt, but Shadow hit him hard, knocking him off his feet into the snowbank. Dylan tackled the second, twisting his arm back and forcing him down until he heard the sharp clatter of a handgun hitting the ground. The third man dropped Finn's bundle in panic and bolted toward the van. Dylan lunged after him but stopped short to scoop up the baby, pressing Finn close against his chest, feeling the small boy's shallow, rapid breaths. Finn whimpered softly, cold but alive. The man Shadow had pinned writhed beneath the dog's weight, cursing angrily, his breath steaming in the frozen air. Dylan barked a command and Shadow eased off, circling the captive with a deep, menacing growl. Dylan knelt down, grabbing the man's jacket and jerking him upright. "Who sent you?" Dylan demanded, his voice low and cutting. The man, tall and broad-shouldered beneath his heavy coat, with pale skin and unshaven stubble clinging to his sharp jaw, spat into the snow. His dark eyes burned with defiance. "You don't want to know, Mercer." Dylan tightened his grip, twisting until the man winced. "Try me." After a long pause, the man finally hissed, "We work for Arden. Special Acquisitions." Dylan's chest tightened at the confirmation, his mind flashing back to the files on the USB. Why Finn? The man hesitated, his jaw clenched before muttering, "Kids, valuable. Unique antibodies. Orders were to bring him to a secure site. Arden doesn't ask questions. They just pay." Dylan reached into the man's coat pocket, pulling out a slick black Arden Pharmaceuticals access card clipped to a lanyard. The name read Peter Klein, and below it, Security Division. Peter's breathing came fast, sharp in the frigid silence, but his voice was steady when he added, "You're in over your head. You have no idea who's involved. Victor Dane's just a middleman. You think Arden's the only one?" Before Dylan could press further, a sharp whistle echoed from beyond the van. Two more silhouettes emerged from the tree line, armed and fast. Dylan knew he couldn't stay, not with Finn in his arms and Ava waiting back at the cabin. He barked a command, and Shadow lunged forward again, forcing the new arrivals to duck for cover as Dylan retreated into the woods. Snow whipped into his face as he sprinted through the frozen pines, clutching Finn tightly, Shadow bounding at his side. By the time they reached the cabin, Ava was pacing the living room, tears streaming down her face. When she saw Finn bundled against Dylan's chest, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably as Dylan knelt to comfort her. Shadow stood guard by the door, his amber eyes glowing in the dim light, ears pricked for the faintest sound outside. Setting Finn carefully into Ava's arms, Dylan leaned back against the wall, his breaths coming ragged and heavy. The stolen USB, the access card, Victor's threats, all of it was converging into a bigger picture, one he still didn't fully understand. But one thing was certain now, Arden wasn't just running illegal tests. They were operating a network, using Victor and others like him to acquire children whose genetics made them valuable. And they weren't going to stop. Dylan's hand rested on Shadow's back, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing beneath his palm. For the first time in years, he felt the old instincts from his service days awaken, the part of him that once led men into hostile zones. Protecting Ava and Finn wasn't just an obligation anymore, it was war. The storm had quieted into an eerie stillness by dawn, blanketing North Haven beneath an icy hush. The world outside Dylan Mercer's cabin looked carved from glass and silence, but inside, tension buzzed like static in the air. The Arden Pharmaceuticals access card rested on the table beside Dylan's laptop, its black plastic a reminder of the night's events. Finn lay bundled against Ava's chest on the couch, her hazel eyes wide but distant, and Shadow sat upright near the door, tail still and ears pricked as if expecting danger to come knocking at any moment. Dylan stood by the window, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching the horizon fade into a mist of pale blue frost. His face, still shadowed by exhaustion, carried an edge of focus he hadn't worn in years, not since Iraq. The part of him that had once navigated hostile terrain was awake again, restless, calculating. The silence broke when headlights swept across the driveway. Shadow's deep growl vibrated against the floorboards, but Dylan relaxed slightly when he recognized the figure stepping out of a frost-dusted SUV. Ethan Cole had arrived. At 44, Ethan's tall, muscular frame moved with practiced efficiency, his heavy boots crunching into the frozen gravel as he approached the cabin. His sandy blonde hair was cropped short, and his neatly trimmed beard framed a square jaw etched with faint scars from old shrapnel wounds. Dressed in a dark tactical jacket and worn jeans, his green eyes were sharp but softened briefly when he spotted Ava watching from the couch. Inside, Ethan dropped his duffel bag on the table and removed his gloves. "Morning," he said in a low voice, though his expression was grim. "Peter Klein's intel checks out. Arden's movements were flagged by the department weeks ago, but the higher-ups didn't approve any raids. Someone's pulling strings from above." Dylan's jaw tightened. "We need to find Finn's trail before they move him again. That cold storage facility wasn't just a drop point." Ethan nodded and unfolded a tablet from his bag, swiping through files until he pulled up an aerial map. "I cross-referenced Peter's badge ID with Arden's restricted access logs. There's a secondary site here," he said, tapping on a marked location deep inside the forest. Underground. Completely off the books. The company lists it as a decommissioned refrigeration unit, but satellite images show power consumption off the charts. Dylan leaned over the table, scanning the map, his blue-gray eyes narrowing. "So, that's where they're prepping him." "Most likely," Ethan confirmed. "Problem is, they're not staying put." Before Dylan could ask, Ethan's phone buzzed, and he glanced down, his expression shifting as he read an urgent message. "One of my guys on traffic watch spotted a black transport van moving north about 15 minutes ago," Ethan said quickly. "Snow tires, no plates, matches Arden's vehicle profile." Dylan grabbed his jacket, Shadow immediately rising to his feet, muscles rippling beneath his thick coat. "Let's move." They loaded into Ethan's SUV, Shadow leaping effortlessly into the back seat, his breath fogging against the window as his ears twitched forward. The forest roads were treacherous, thick sheets of ice crunching under the tires as Ethan pushed the vehicle harder than it was built for. Ava stayed behind with Rachel Collins, who had arrived earlier to secure the cabin and care for her while Dylan hunted the trail. As they reached the outskirts of the forest, Ethan spotted deep tire tracks carved into the snow, fresh enough to still glisten faintly in the morning light. "That's them," he muttered, cutting the engine and motioning for Dylan to grab his rifle. They moved fast on foot, their boots sinking deep into the powder, the freezing air biting their lungs. Shadow ran ahead, nose low, weaving expertly between skeletal trees, his training kicking in like muscle memory. Suddenly, his sharp bark echoed through the trees, ears pinned forward, tail rigid. Dylan dropped into a crouch, motioning Ethan to circle right. Through the shifting curtains of snow, he spotted it. A black transport van carving aggressively through the icy forest road below. "They're running fast," Ethan whispered, raising his binoculars. Shadow barked again, pacing restlessly until Dylan gave him the command. The dog sprinted ahead, cutting diagonally toward the road, his powerful body plowing effortlessly through the drifts. Dylan steadied his rifle, firing a warning shot into the snowbank just ahead of the van's tires. The crack of the gun echoed like thunder through the frozen silence. The van skidded violently, fishtailing on the icy road before screeching to a stop. Dylan and Ethan burst from the tree line, weapons raised, moving swiftly toward the vehicle as Shadow growled low, circling near the passenger's side. The driver's door slammed open, and a tall, wiry man stumbled out, his parka half unzipped, revealing a black Arden security vest beneath. His face was pale and gaunt, with deep shadows beneath his gray-blue eyes, his cracked lips curling into something between a sneer and a smirk. "You're making a mistake," the man said breathlessly, his voice muffled by the wind. Dylan ignored him, yanking open the rear door, his heart pounding, but the interior was empty. Crates stacked along the walls bore Arden's sterile insignia, but there was no sign of Finn. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, sweeping the snow with his flashlight. The driver laughed bitterly, spitting into the snow. "You think you're chasing the right van? That was the plan." Dylan stepped forward sharply, grabbing the man's vest and slamming him back against the side of the vehicle. "Where is he?" Dylan's voice was low but razor-edged, the weight of suppressed fury behind each word. The man hesitated, scanning Dylan's face before finally muttering, "Lower sector, under the refrigeration plant. They call it Sub-Level 9. Ethan's head snapped toward Dylan, his expression grim. "That matches the logs," he said. Peter was telling the truth. As they restrained the driver, Shadow's low growl drew Dylan's attention back toward the tree line. Footsteps, several, crunched faintly beyond the ridge. Dylan scanned the snowy pines and caught a glimpse of 3 figures in dark tactical gear, watching them from higher ground, their faces hidden by frost-covered masks. "They're not Arden," Ethan muttered, gripping his sidearm. The strangers didn't move closer. After a tense moment, they simply vanished into the fog of drifting snow, their presence lingering like a shadow Dylan couldn't shake. Back at the SUV, Dylan stored the confiscated crates for evidence before pulling onto the frozen road, his grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. "If Sub-Level 9's real," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence, "it isn't just about Finn. Arden's running something down there they don't want anyone seeing." Dylan's jaw tightened, his blue-gray eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. "Then that's where we're going." Behind them, Shadow rested his head on the armrest, his amber eyes wide and unblinking as the trees blurred past. Somewhere beneath the layers of frost and silence, a darker hunt had already begun, and Dylan knew the game had just shifted. The frozen forest stretched endlessly beneath the pale moonlight, but Dylan Mercer's focus was locked on the looming structure ahead, the abandoned Arden cold storage facility. On the surface, it looked derelict. Cracked concrete walls, frost-covered windows, rusted security fencing half buried in snow. But beneath the silent exterior lay Sub-Level 9, the underground lab Peter Klein had mentioned, the place where they had taken Finn. Dylan crouched behind a drift of snow with Ethan Cole at his side, Shadow pressed low against the frozen ground, his amber eyes locked on the steel service doors leading inside. Dylan's military instincts hummed beneath his skin. He could almost feel the vibrations of danger ahead. "2 guards at the southeast door," Ethan whispered, scanning through night vision binoculars. "Arden security. Semi-automatic rifles. Military grade." Dylan's jaw tightened. "They're not guarding food storage," he muttered. They waited until the patrol shifted toward the opposite side before slipping silently down the slope, boots sinking deep into snowdrifts. Shadow moved first, his low frame cutting a clean path, ears pricked and tail low. When they reached the metal doors, Ethan knelt quickly, pulling out a small lock override from his kit. 5 seconds. Ethan murmured as he worked, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Make it quick." The lock clicked. Dylan pulled the door open just wide enough for Shadow to slip inside, his padded paws making no sound against the slick concrete floor. Dylan and Ethan followed close behind, their rifles raised, as the hum of distant machinery replaced the howl of the wind outside. The corridor ahead was narrow, illuminated by pale overhead strips that cast a sterile blue glow along the concrete walls. Security cameras tracked slowly from their mounts, and Dylan spotted one already burned out, wires dangling loosely. They weren't the first to breach this level. Shadow halted suddenly, sniffing the air before letting out a faint, warning chuff. Dylan crouched, his blue-gray eyes scanning the hallway before signaling Ethan forward. "Left," Ethan whispered after checking a corner. "Control room's through there." Inside, the small room was lined with workstations and security panels. Dylan quickly slipped a flash drive into the primary terminal, copying data from the servers as he scanned through what he could. His pulse began to race as words on the screen solidified into meaning. Neonatal Adaptive Immunity Project. The files were labeled under Project Helios, but these were far more detailed than the ones hidden on Ava's teddy bear USB. Dylan scrolled through records, charts, trial logs, signed consents. His stomach dropped when he reached the patient index. Finn Lawson, subject F23, priority specimen. Next to Finn's entry were dense medical annotations describing antibody responses, experimental drug phases, and multiple flagged warnings about critical immune destabilization risks. But one line caught Dylan's attention immediately. Biological mother, deceased due to complications from compound Va-17A. Dylan froze, the cursor blinking like an accusation on the screen. He clicked deeper into the document. The truth was worse than he imagined. Ava's mother hadn't died of fever at all. She had been injected with an unapproved immune-altering compound during an earlier Arden trial. A list of internal memos attached detailed the adverse reaction: organ failure, rapid immune collapse, and a cover-up to classify the death as natural complications. His fist clenched on the edge of the desk, knuckles whitening. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his green eyes narrowing as he read the lines Dylan highlighted. "They killed her," Ethan said under his breath. "They used her as a test subject and then blamed a fever. It only got worse." Dylan pulled up the authorization logs, the scanned signatures of individuals who approved Finn's participation in Arden's longitudinal immune harvest program. At the top of the page was Victor Dane's name. Dylan's jaw locked, his chest heaving with restrained fury. The digital document showed everything: Victor's signed consent to deliver Finn into Arden's custody, time-stamped 2 weeks before Ava and Finn were left alone in the cold. In exchange, a transfer receipt detailed a 7-figure payout from Arden's research discretionary fund into an offshore account. "Son of a," Ethan muttered, cutting himself off with a sharp inhale. Dylan forced himself to breathe steadily, though a storm brewed inside him. He slid a small recorder from his pocket, activating it silently as he scrolled further, capturing every damning piece of evidence: Arden's secret memos, the contracts, the payments. Suddenly, a low hum filled the room, followed by the faint vibration of footsteps above them. Shadow's ears perked instantly, and the dog growled softly, hackles bristling. Dylan motioned Ethan to kill the lights on the panel as they crouched low against the wall. The door creaked open. A woman stepped inside, tall and slender, her white lab coat streaked with faint gray stains. Her sharp, angular face was framed by straight black hair pulled into a tight bun, and thin-rimmed glasses sat perched on her delicate nose. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes scanned the dim room sharply before settling on Dylan and Ethan crouched near the terminal. She didn't scream. Instead, she exhaled slowly and said quietly, "You shouldn't be here." Dylan stood slowly, his rifle lowered but ready. "Then help us make this worth the risk," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "Where's Finn?" The woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a tight line before finally speaking. "I'm Dr. Elise Moran, lead clinical supervisor for Helios. Finn's being prepped downstairs for an extraction procedure. You don't have much time." Ethan's hand tightened on his sidearm. "Extraction of what?" Her eyes darted briefly to the terminal, then back to Dylan, and for a fraction of a second, he saw something flicker there. Guilt, maybe even fear. "His antibodies," she admitted quietly. "They'll drain him until he crashes. He won't survive the process." Dylan's stomach twisted, his voice sharpening like steel. "Then you're going to take us to him." Dr. Moran hesitated, visibly conflicted, but after a beat she nodded slightly. "If I do this," she whispered, "you never found me." They moved quickly, Shadow leading as they slipped back into the dim hallway, Dylan's recorder still capturing everything. But just as they reached the stairwell to Sub-Level 9, a deep metallic clang reverberated through the walls, followed by alarms blaring overhead. Red lights pulsed along the ceiling, bathing the narrow corridor in an ominous glow. Arden Security had discovered the breach. Dylan glanced at Ethan, their shared nod silent but unyielding. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about exposing everything. The red lights pulsed violently across the concrete corridor, alarms blaring and reverberating through the walls of Sub-Level 9. The cold air burned Dylan Mercer's lungs as he crouched near the stairwell, his rifle gripped tight, Shadow pressed low at his side, ears pinned forward and muscles taut beneath his thick coat. Beside him, Ethan Cole adjusted his tactical vest, green eyes sharp and steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Dr. Elise Moran stood slightly behind, her slim frame trembling, her pale hands clenched tightly around a stolen security badge. "Finn's down this hall," Elise whispered urgently, her dark brown eyes darting nervously between the flashing lights and Dylan's face. "They've locked him inside a cryogenic chamber, low-temperature sedation before they drain his blood." Dylan's jaw clenched, his voice like gravel beneath his breath. "Show us the way." The hallway stretched ahead, lined with steel doors bearing small biometric panels, the hum of hidden machinery growing louder as they neared the lower levels. From behind one reinforced glass window, Dylan caught glimpses of strange machines pumping chilled vapor into transparent capsules. Newborns wired to monitors, their tiny chests rising weakly as fluids dripped through tubes. Elisa's jaw tightened, guilt flickering across her sharp features, but she didn't stop moving. Shadow's amber eyes locked suddenly on a narrow corridor branching left. The German shepherd gave a low bark, nose twitching, and Dylan instantly followed the signal. "He's scenting Finn," Dylan whispered. Ethan nodded and moved forward, pistol raised, scanning corners with military precision. They reached a set of double doors labeled cryogenic storage, restricted access. Elise swiped the stolen badge, her slender fingers shaking slightly as the panel clicked green. The door hissed open, releasing a gust of freezing air that spilled into the hall. Inside, the room was dim and bitterly cold. Stainless steel counters lined the walls, illuminated by faint blue light spilling from the glass chamber at the center of the room. Inside the chamber, Finn lay wrapped in tubes, his tiny body partially restrained, his skin pale beneath a frost of condensed mist. His breath fogged faintly against the chilled glass, fragile but steady. Dylan's chest tightened, an old scar of loss tearing open at the sight. Memories of Elena, the wife he had buried 3 years ago, and the baby boy he never got to hold crashed like a wave against his ribs. He placed a hand against the chamber, forcing his voice steady. "Hang on, kid, we've got you." Ethan moved toward the control panel, scanning quickly. "Security protocols on lockdown," he muttered, glancing at Elise. Her sharp brows knit tightly. "The cryostasis will fail if we force it open. We need to disengage the sedation sequence first." Shadow barked low, pacing anxiously near the door, his hackles rising. Dylan spun instinctively. Footsteps echoed behind them, boots striking hard against the concrete floor. Victor Dane appeared. The man's pristine black coat and expensive leather gloves looked painfully out of place among the sterile chaos of the lab. His pale blue eyes, sharp and calculating, landed on Dylan first, then shifted briefly to Ethan and Elise before settling on Finn's chamber. Behind him, 2 armed Arden security guards flanked his sides. "You need to step aside, Mercer," Victor said calmly, though his voice carried a dangerous undertone. "You don't understand what's at stake here." Dylan stepped forward, his tall, broad frame squaring against Victor's lean figure. "I understand you sold your stepson for a paycheck." Victor's jaw flexed, his carefully sculpted composure cracking just slightly. "You think this is about money?" he snapped. "This isn't just Arden. There are contracts, people far above us. Finn isn't yours to save." Before Dylan could respond, Ethan raised his weapon. "You're under arrest, Victor," he said coldly, his green eyes hard. "North Haven PD, federal directives in motion. You're done." Victor laughed softly, shaking his head. "You don't have a warrant." Ethan stepped closer, pressing the muzzle against Victor's shoulder. "I have probable cause, and I have you caught in the act." The standoff snapped when one of Victor's guards raised his rifle. Shadow launched forward instantly, a blur of muscle and black and tan fur, teeth bared as he tackled the man to the ground. Dylan pivoted left, firing a controlled burst into the second guard's weapon, sending it skittering across the floor. Victor lunged back toward the wall, fumbling for a concealed comms device, but Ethan slammed him against the counter, locking his arms behind his back in one swift, practiced motion. Victor snarled, straining against Ethan's grip, but Dylan ignored him, moving fast toward the chamber controls. "Elise," Dylan barked, "get him out." Her slender hands flew over the interface, dark hair falling loose from its tight bun, her breaths ragged but focused. After a tense moment, a sharp click echoed through the chamber. The blue lights dimmed, and the seals disengaged with a hiss. Dylan tore the door open and scooped Finn gently into his arms, cradling the tiny, trembling boy against his chest. "We've got him," Dylan whispered, his throat tight. But there was no time to celebrate. Overhead, a deep metallic groan vibrated through the walls, followed by a chilling automated voice over the intercom. "Warning, containment protocol initiated. Facility lockdown in T-minus 90 seconds. Elise's face drained of color. "They're purging the lab," she said hoarsely. "They're wiping everything. Data, samples, witnesses." Ethan cursed, hauling Victor roughly to his feet. "We need to move, now." They bolted into the corridor, alarms wailing as red emergency lights strobed wildly above. Shadow led the way, weaving expertly through the maze of narrow halls, his sharp barks guiding them around blind corners and warning of approaching guards. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the ground, and a fireball erupted somewhere deep below, heat surging up through the ventilation shafts. Dylan shielded Finn as ceiling panels collapsed in bursts of sparks and falling debris. Elise stumbled, but Ethan caught her arm, dragging her forward. When they reached the upper exit stairwell, a loud crack split the air. One of the main support beams groaned under the heat. Ava's terrified cry echoed faintly from above. Rachel had brought her closer to the perimeter when she heard the alarms. In the chaos, a steel panel crashed down behind them, cutting off the secondary escape route. Shadow leapt back, barking wildly as Dylan shouted, "Go! Go! Shadow!" The German shepherd bolted up the stairs and into the blizzard-chilled air beyond. At the top, Dylan saw Ava frozen at the perimeter line, her tiny figure trembling in the snow. Just as another explosion ripped through the lower level, Shadow bounded forward, seizing Ava's sleeve gently in his powerful jaws and yanking her backward, pulling her clear of the falling debris just as the ceiling collapsed where she had been standing. Dylan burst outside seconds later, Finn pressed against his chest, Ethan dragging Victor in handcuffs and Elise stumbling behind them. Behind them, Sub-Level 9 erupted in a plume of fire and shattered steel, the sound reverberating through the frozen pines as the Arden facility crumbled into its own grave. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Finn's fragile breathing and Shadow's ragged panting. But in Dylan's chest, a single thought burned steady and sharp. This wasn't over. Arden might have lost their lab, but the men above them, the ones Victor had hinted at, were still out there. And Dylan Mercer wasn't done fighting. The morning after the explosion, the ruins of the Arden facility smoldered beneath a bleak gray sky, plumes of black smoke curling above the snow-dusted pines. Dylan Mercer stood at the edge of the wreckage, his coat pulled tightly against the bitter wind. Shadow sitting close at his side, ears twitching at the occasional pop of collapsing steel beams deep within the rubble. Ethan Cole stood nearby, speaking quietly into his phone, coordinating with local law enforcement who had been called in overnight to secure the scene. It wasn't long before the FBI arrived. A convoy of black SUVs rolled steadily across the icy road leading to the site, their tires crunching softly over packed snow. The lead vehicle's door opened, and Special Agent Miriam Harper stepped out. She was in her early 40s, tall and imposing, with sharp cheekbones and a deliberate, composed demeanor. Her short auburn hair framed a pale, angular face, and her storm-gray eyes scanned the area with precise focus. Clad in a dark tactical parka and black gloves, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years leading covert operations. "Dylan Mercer," she said calmly as she approached, her voice low but firm. "I'm Agent Harper, lead investigator with the FBI's Bioethics and Organized Crime Task Force. I've been briefed by Ethan. I understand you recovered encrypted files." Dylan handed over the small drive and recorder he had secured from Sub-Level 9. Harper slipped them into an evidence pouch, nodding slightly. "What you uncovered here," she said, glancing at the smoldering ruins, "is bigger than Arden Pharmaceuticals. There's an entire network behind this, an underground pipeline of genetic data, stolen biological material, and child trafficking disguised as medical research." Ethan stepped forward, his square jaw tight beneath the neatly trimmed beard. "Victor Dane was their linchpin," he said. "Middle management feeding kids into Arden's projects. But based on what Dylan found, he wasn't working alone." Agent Harper nodded. "Victor's in custody now. He'll face federal charges along with several Arden executives we've already detained." Her gray eyes softened slightly as she looked toward Dylan. "The files you recovered give us enough leverage to shut down their entire operation." Inside the makeshift field station the FBI had set up, Dylan sat across from Harper while Ethan stood at his side. Monitors flickered with decrypted evidence from the USB, contracts, emails, clinical reports. Among them were high-level communications connecting Arden's research to offshore accounts, shadow investors, and a clandestine lab network stretching across state lines. Dylan's chest tightened as he read the details. Victor had been part of something far larger than anyone suspected. Shadow lay near Dylan's boots, head resting between his paws, his amber eyes following the movements in the room with quiet vigilance. Every so often, he raised his head when a door opened or a stranger passed too close, letting out a low rumble deep in his chest until Dylan reassured him with a quiet pat. After hours of statements and interviews, Dylan finally stepped outside, the cold air biting sharply at his skin. Across the field, Ava sat bundled in a thick blanket near one of the FBI vans, Finn asleep in her lap. She looked up when Dylan approached, her small face pale and tired but steadier than he'd seen it in days. "Are we safe now?" Ava's voice was small, almost fragile beneath the roar of distant generators. Dylan knelt beside her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Safer than we were yesterday," he said softly. Shadow nosed her hand, and Ava managed the faintest smile as she stroked his fur, clutching Finn closer to her chest. That afternoon, the county family court convened an emergency session with Agent Harper present. Dylan, wearing a dark flannel shirt and boots still dusted in snow, sat opposite a panel of judges as Ava clung tightly to his arm. At the far end of the courtroom, a representative from Child Protective Services detailed the siblings' situation. Given the evidence Dylan and Ethan had recovered, the judge granted Dylan temporary guardianship of Ava and Finn until full adoption proceedings could begin. Dylan's throat tightened when the ruling was read aloud, his hands trembling slightly as Ava leaned into him. For the first time since this nightmare began, a small piece of his fractured world began to feel like it was mending. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Dylan moved Ava and Finn into a quieter part of North Haven, a small rented farmhouse nestled on the edge of the woods. The scars of his PTSD were still there. The late-night jolts awake, the flashes of memory from Iraq, the suffocating guilt over Elena's death. But he began therapy under the guidance of Dr. Claire Winters, a warm, compassionate woman in her mid-30s with chestnut hair pulled back loosely and thoughtful hazel eyes. Claire specialized in trauma recovery, her voice soft yet firm, and she approached Dylan's guarded silences with patience rather than pressure. In their sessions, Dylan spoke about the weight of the past 3 years. The night Elena died in childbirth, the spiral into isolation, and the unexpected way Ava and Finn had pulled him back to life. Claire guided him toward grounding techniques, encouraging him to let Shadow assist during sessions, a method leveraging the canine's calming presence to stabilize panic responses. Shadow, always perceptive, lay at Dylan's feet during therapy, occasionally nudging his knee when Dylan's breath grew uneven. Ava began therapy too, working with Claire in separate sessions to process the trauma she had endured, losing her mother, nearly losing Finn, and surviving Arden's cruelty. Over time, Ava's nightmares lessened, her laughter returning little by little, often sparked by Shadow's playful antics in the backyard. Ethan visited frequently, his bond with Dylan strengthened through everything they had faced together. Over coffee in Dylan's kitchen, they discussed the remaining pieces of the Arden case. Ethan explained that thanks to Dylan's evidence, the FBI had seized multiple Arden research facilities nationwide and indicted over a dozen executives. Arden's CEO had been arrested attempting to flee the country, and Victor Dane, once so smug and untouchable, now awaited trial on federal conspiracy and child endangerment charges. Despite these victories, Dylan knew the work wasn't over. The network Harper had mentioned, the shadow group funding Arden, was still out there, waiting, watching. But for now, his priority was simple: Ava, Finn, and the fragile family they were beginning to build together. One evening, as snow drifted softly outside the farmhouse window, Dylan sat on the couch with Ava nestled against his side and Finn cradled in his arms. Shadow lay sprawled across the rug near the fireplace, his breathing deep and steady. For the first time in years, Dylan felt something unfamiliar but powerful: peace. He glanced down at Ava, her small fingers tangled in Shadow's fur, and whispered quietly, "We're home now." Ava smiled faintly, her tired hazel eyes reflecting the warm glow of the firelight. "Home," she echoed softly, her voice fragile but steady. Outside, the world was still cold, dangerous, and uncertain, but inside, in this quiet corner of North Haven, Dylan Mercer finally felt like he had something worth fighting for again. 6 months had passed since the Arden facility fell, and the long winter had finally surrendered to the first warmth of spring in North Haven. The snow had melted into soft rivulets that trickled between budding pines, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fresh grass. For the first time in years, Dylan Mercer woke without the heaviness of fear pressing on his chest. The small white farmhouse he'd rented on the outskirts of town now looked alive, and its front porch draped with hanging flower baskets Ava had helped plant, a hand-painted mailbox leaning slightly crooked, and the laughter of a child carrying faintly into the open air. Dylan stood in the backyard, sunlight falling across his face as he crouched near the grass, watching Finn toddle unsteadily on chubby legs. The 6-month-old baby boy, once pale and fragile in Arden's cryogenic chamber, was now healthy and thriving, rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed, his tiny fists grasping for the dandelions scattered across the yard. Each time he stumbled into Dylan's waiting arms, his giggles broke like warm sunlight through lingering clouds. Nearby, Shadow, now 6 years old, stretched lazily beneath a maple tree, his thick black and tan fur glinting beneath the sun. His amber eyes followed Finn closely, ears twitching each time the baby squealed, always alert, always watching. The bond between the German shepherd and the two siblings had deepened since that night in the snow. Shadow had gone from soldier to protector, his calm presence grounding Dylan in ways therapy alone never could. Ava was sitting cross-legged on the porch steps, her soft hazel eyes brighter now than Dylan had ever seen them. At 8 years old, her golden blonde hair, once tangled and streaked with dirt when he found her, now shone neatly beneath the sun, braided carefully by Dr. Claire Winters, who often visited on weekends. Ava was coloring on a scrap of cardboard, humming softly under her breath. She looked up suddenly and called out, her small voice ringing clear and strong, "Dad!" Dylan froze. The single word hung in the air, settling deep in his chest before his heart caught up. For months, Ava had called him Dylan, sometimes Mr. Dylan when she was shy, but this was different. This wasn't a slip, it was a choice. Dylan turned slowly, his throat tight, his blue-gray eyes meeting her steady gaze. Ava smiled shyly, holding up the drawing she'd been working on, her cheeks pink with the effort. He walked over, kneeling in the grass beside her. "Say that again," he whispered, voice rough around the edges. Her lips trembled slightly, but she smiled wider this time. "Dad?" Something cracked open inside him then, the same part of his heart that had been locked away since the night Elena and their unborn son were lost. For 3 years, Dylan Mercer had lived like a ghost, defined by what he'd lost. But kneeling there, with Ava's small hand resting on his, Finn's laughter carrying through the spring air, and Shadow's calm gaze holding steady, he felt a truth he hadn't let himself believe. They were his family now. Later that afternoon, they drove into town for the final court session. Dylan wore a crisp button-down shirt Ava had insisted he iron, his tall frame awkward but dignified beneath the formal setting. Ava wore a pale blue dress Rachel Collins had picked out, her tiny fingers clutching the stuffed teddy bear that had once hidden the USB drive holding Arden's secrets. Inside the county courthouse, the air was warm and filled with quiet anticipation. Judge Patricia Hernandez, a dignified woman in her mid-50s with salt and pepper hair pulled into a low bun, presided over the hearing. Her steady brown eyes softened as she glanced at the siblings seated beside Dylan, Shadow lying obediently at their feet. "You've been through a lot," Judge Hernandez said gently, her voice carrying both authority and kindness. "But today, we celebrate a new beginning." When the gavel struck, the words Dylan had been longing to hear finally became reality. By the authority of the state, the adoption of Ava Lawson and Finn Lawson by Dylan Mercer is hereby finalized. Ava squealed softly, throwing her arms around Dylan's neck while Finn babbled incoherently from his lap, unaware of the magnitude of the moment. Shadow leaned forward, resting his big head against Dylan's knee, his warm breath puffing softly as if he understood too. After the ceremony, as they stepped out into the soft afternoon sunlight, Ava pulled a folded piece of paper from her small backpack. Her eyes glimmered with pride as she handed it to Dylan. "I made this for you," she whispered. It was a hand-drawn picture of the 4 of them standing in front of their farmhouse, Ava, Finn, Dylan, and Shadow, with the sun shining overhead and flowers blooming along the yard. Above them, in uneven but careful handwriting, she had written, "Our family." Dylan swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden blur in his vision. He knelt to Ava's level, pulling her close. "It's perfect," he said softly, his voice catching. "You, Finn, Shadow, you're my whole world now." As they drove home that evening, windows down and sunlight spilling across the road, Dylan glanced in the rearview mirror. Ava sat hugging Finn in his car seat, humming quietly, while Shadow sat beside her, his head resting protectively on her shoulder. For the first time in so many years, Dylan allowed himself to believe in something better. In the quiet of his heart, he whispered the truth he had finally come to understand. Sometimes we think we're saving someone, but they're the ones who save us from the darkness. Life has a way of leading us through the darkest, coldest nights, moments when we believe all hope is lost. But sometimes God sends us a quiet miracle. Not always in thunder or lightning, but in the smallest, simplest ways. A hand reaching out, a heart choosing love, a child whispering "Dad" for the very first time. Dylan thought he was the one saving Ava, Finn, and Shadow that snowy night. But the truth is, they saved him. They gave him a second chance to heal, to love, and to find his way back home, This story reminds us that even when we are broken, God always leaves a door open. No matter how heavy the past, there's always grace, always hope, always a reason to keep fighting for love and family. Sometimes the miracle we pray for doesn't change our life instantly. It changes us first. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to say a prayer for the children without a safe home and for families still searching for each other. Share your thoughts in the comments. Who did this story make you think of? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next inspiring story. If you believe in everyday miracles, share this video and help us spread hope. May God bless you and your family, guide your steps, and remind you, even in life's coldest storms, that you are never truly alone.